Thanks for the invite to this conference. I just want to get a gauge of the audience in this room, actually. How many of you have either travelled out to the emerging markets or travelled regularly to the emerging markets? Wow, excellent. Okay, so the reason I ask is because I'm really not here today as someone who knows everything about emerging markets. Many of my experiences will hopefully be familiar to you, but at least if there are some new insights, or if my experiences is something that you can relate to, then this presentation might well be useful. Okay, so just looking at the agenda briefly, I'm going to break it up into three parts. Tell you very briefly about my background. Stephen's done a grand job of that already. A little bit about Emerald, the business that I work for, and then go into talking a little bit about some of the data, some of the trends around the business potential in emerging markets, but more specifically also then to publishing as a commercial outfit. And then finally, the second half of that presentation will just look at some of my personal experiences from a cultural, legal and political, the challenges in relation to those, and then also some hints and tips as to the kind of things that I've found as I've spent my time out in those markets. As I said, not going to spend too much time on this. I sit on the executive board at Emerald, leading Emerald's operations in those areas, having spent 10 years in academic publishing. You might note there I studied international business and Japanese at the undergraduate level. Now, in hindsight, Japanese is probably the wrong language, but I suppose living in Japan was probably more compelling at that age, and well, what does a 19-year-old know about the future of the world economy anyway? So, moving on, a little bit about Emerald. We're a global publisher. Our ethos has always been about linking research and practice. We have a reasonable network of 106,000 editors, authors, and advisors, and 5,000 customers globally. Our subject focus, our subject specialism really is in management, but we also offer broad subject specialisms in areas such as education, engineering and health and social care, for example. And we have a global presence. We have customers in over 130 countries. We have for some time now established a presence in many countries. We've got representatives on the ground in 28 countries, out of which we have 8 established offices, and many of them are in the emerging markets that is part of the discussion today. So we have an office in Beijing, an office in Delhi, an office in Sao Paulo, and an office in Johannesburg. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit and go into some data sets, which I particularly find interesting. And this particular slide I've used for a little bit of time now because I do find it graphically interesting as to what it shows. And this is actually taken from World Bank and PwC estimates to 2050, tracking GDP growth or decline, in fact, of emerging markets, but then versus those of the more developed markets. So what you can see quite easily on that graphic there is that by 2050 it's anticipated that China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia will outstrip the growth of GDP and have a higher ranking than the more established economies of today. So what you see there is a decline with the likes of US, Japan, Germany and the UK over that period. So what's behind the rise of the emerging markets? It's actually the middle classes typically, which comprise a consumer society and drive volume consumption that is behind the rise of the emerging markets. It's driving consumption behaviour, and when you look at the sheer numbers of the middle classes in countries like China, India and Brazil, they do make for a powerful economic force. There are a number of other interesting facts. I'm not going to talk to all of these. The slide deck is available on the ALPS website, so you can have a look at these at your own leisure afterwards if you wish. Okay, so moving closer to publishing, I suppose. What I wanted to do was to share this slide. I think it's a couple of years old now, but this was a piece of research carried out by PCG in which they surveyed a number of librarians globally to really determine where they felt library budgets were going to move to by 2014. We're actually in 2014 now, so interesting to see if these numbers have been mapped out as they're suggested. From my perspective, working at Emerald and talking to librarians and talking about their budgets, it feels like that probably is a true reflection, where quite simply it reflects the fact that in the Asia Pacific and South America, library budgets were shown to still be on the increase, whereas in Europe and North America, budgets were either stagnating or declining. I don't know if that's the same experience that many of you have seen within your particular markets. I'm going to use this slide really as a link between the data sets that I've just talked about, with specific example of publishing trends here, and then looking at the publishing considerations as we go forwards. And this slide actually uses China as an example with regards to scholarly research output. And what it shows here is that in the area of engineering specifically, Chinese research scholarly output in that area has actually exceeded that of the US. Now, whereas the top graph talks to quantity, you might well ask, well, okay, quantity versus quality. Well, the bottom graph represents an indication of where quality output from China is heading as well. And it highlights the Chinese output as a percentage of US citations. And actually, at 80% in 2012, I dare say that at that growth and trajectory, that will probably catch up to the US very soon as well. So quantity as well as quality as an output from the emerging markets, using China as an example. Going to talk now a little bit about publishing in emerging markets. There are a number of considerations when operating publishing in emerging markets. One of those considerations are standards and ethics. And I think ethical decision making can be quite situational and context specific in these markets. Sort of institutional norms and the ways of working practices can be quite different to the Western world and the way that we would determine standards and ethics to be. And I think as international publishers, it is down to us to actually go out there and promote international standards and ethics. That's not an easy thing to do. You know, there are obstacles that you will come across in that respect, but I think it is our duty to go out there. And one of the ways we can do that is really by offering clear guidelines and expectations to meeting those kind of standards, such as copyright issues, etc., etc. Thinking about quality in as far as publishing in emerging markets, I think what you'll find, you can tell me afterwards, but the emerging markets definitely pay a lot of attention to impact factors. ISI is an important metric that they strive for, and these metrics are highly valued. The approach that we need to take as publishers, I suppose, from my experiences going out there, understanding that actually the world is more than just ISI. You know, there are other factors, other elements that we can take to the board, other metrics that we can take, and really engaging with them in that conversation is something that can differentiate you from entering those markets. Looking at funding then, what I would say to this is, I suppose, the most common reason given by researchers for publishing is the idea of disseminating research output as widely as possible, whereas slightly cynical view, but I suppose what they're really driven by is where the funding exists, and on that basis we can also work with them to really help them realise the full potential. That poses a set of different challenges from a financial perspective, but also in consideration of the kind of business models that you might deploy, thinking about where the funding policies are, and really honing in on that research output so that we're meeting their needs, but also meeting a need for wider global dissemination of that output. And of course, doing all of the things that I've just mentioned there creates opportunities for publishers. What we need to be mindful of is the need to be flexible in our approach in understanding how we can help institutions and associations realise global visibility. And what we can't do is we can't underestimate the value of true relationship development in gaining success in these emerging markets. So now that I've looked at some of the publishing trends in emerging markets, I'd like to share some of my personal experiences about doing business in these markets. I've taken this from the perspective of looking at them as challenges. So the first challenge being cultural. And relationships is the first point on the agenda there for that particular challenge. I think you've got to make a real effort to invest time in the relationships. I think anything other than that comes across as fickle and will be recognised as such. I recall spending 3 hours in a banquet at the Inner Mongolia border with a number of customers. Long banquets are quite the norm if you've been out there. Minus 30-degree temperatures in an outdoor restaurant. I think I invested my time in that particular relationship. With regards to relationship also, there's elements of etiquette and respect that you need to take into consideration. And simple things such as understanding seating hierarchies. Traditionally, attending meetings in these nations, there's some sort of hierarchical order as to where you sit. And that might not be the same as what you would assume in a normal Western meeting. Thinking about local flexibility, the point I would pull out here is you have to be willing to assume and adjust to different ways of doing things, and one of those is punctuality. You can't really have the same expectations to timekeeping as you would when you're attending Western meetings, so you should yourself aim to be there on time or a little bit early, but you might not necessarily expect to find the clients or the customers waiting there on the other end. In fact, maybe 10 to 15, 20 minutes later even is quite normal practice. And as far as language is concerned, whilst I said I probably chose the wrong language in Japanese, however, having lived out in Japan and understood the Eastern culture was a great way of transferring that to these particular markets, particularly those in the East, but actually making some kind of effort to at least say some words actually does go a long way in creating and helping nurturing those relationships. So that was the cultural challenge. Wanted to talk a little bit now about legal challenges, and I've taken this from the perspective of market entry. Market entry is from the point of not early market entry, but actually something a bit more mature, to the point that if you are at a point of creating a legal entity or a legal presence, that's where I was going to take it from. And my experience of this is, you know, so many things to consider with particular regards to local laws and the business partners that you may choose. From my personal experience, I went about setting up a number of the legal entities for Emerald in these markets, and with best intentions, I set about hiring probably top 4 firms to deploy this strategy. With the best intentions that they would have the right level of impact, they would make the right impression. But actually what I found is that even though they were based in those markets, having local offices there, because they are an international firm, they actually adopted more of an international mindset and actually missed some of the local nuances, missing out some of the local cultural understanding that actually would have helped the process along a lot smoother, particularly working with those that are affected on the ground already, if you've got a team already established, and migrating them to a legal presence in the sense of a fully formed subsidiary or a fully formed legal entity. So from my experience, I think working with someone in the middle is probably the best approach. Those companies that would have definitely an international knowledge and understanding, but then also really have a good local knowledge and experience. The next challenge I would highlight is the political challenge. A lot of these markets, can be quite volatile. Just in the nature, the pace of growth dictates that these markets will suffer some level of volatility. And you've really got to be mindful of that. And one of the ways that you can work to those is to really work in broadening your networks and relationships at the government and institutional level. Because some of those people that you're working with one day might not be there the next, unfortunately. So really broadening those networks. Another aspect of working in these emerging markets as an approach you can take is a lobbying strategy. It's quite acceptable where there's a bigger political agenda. Rather than be a lone voice, you can actually work with your competitors or other groups of associations that have a similar interest and lobby the government in respect of those changes. Really, with regards to that, then doing all those things, you can really go about building credibility and sustaining integrity. I think the way that you go about that is, as Anton said, is do your homework, and that needs to be done ahead of time. There's a lot to be understood before you go into the markets. You can't go in there naively, expect things to be in a certain way, and you have your perceptions quashed. One of the ways you can achieve that is by putting the right people on the ground, and I think there's a lot to be said about finding the right people with a good local understanding but with a global awareness so that they can work in a global organisation. And importantly, I think it's right that you look to maintain your core values. Don't forget where you are as an international business based in a Western country, going out to new markets that might not be familiar. Maintaining your core values allows you to maintain integrity, and I think that's important. But the actual value of nurturing relationships, again, as I said, it can't be underestimated, and that's both at an institutional and government level. And in fact, in China, they have a phrase called guangxi, which is all about nurturing those relationships, and they put a lot of store on that. And a final slide, and this is just an infographic that I found recently by an artist called Yang Liu, who actually cleverly manages to sort of translate some of the differences between the West and the East. Here for your amusement, I found them interesting. I hope you do too. Okay, that was the end of my presentation. I've probably rattled through that quicker than you'd anticipated, but happy to take questions. Any questions?
I've got a...
Yes, Stephen.
I keep forgetting I've got a microphone. I think the point you made in terms of some of the legal, financial, human resources challenges, I think on a lot of occasions we would operate individually as organisations when we're moving into new markets. And I just wonder to what extent Emerald has partnered with other UK organisations or organisations expanding into those territories to share that information when it might not have been available from some local sources.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, speaking to Anton prior to this, I mean, as there are different stages of market entry, I think there are different approaches that you can take. I think finding out experiences of those who've already entered the markets before you is always particularly useful. But then I was talking to Anton how we used UKTI when we were looking at market entry into different markets other than the emerging markets as we've talked today. And we did find that particularly useful. It gave us a foot in. Talking to other publishers, you know, those that have already been longer established, for different aspects. I mean, some have been longer established on the publishing function, some have been longer established on the, you know, on the sales territory, market export entry focus. So, absolutely valuable, and well, we do the same.
So I have a second question was related to, and again from the hands that went up earlier around the room, there's a lot of staff and organisations travelling to more developing parts of the world. How can you guarantee that they're representing your organisation effectively in the right way?
Staff from here going out?
Yes.
Or that's a good question. I mean, I suppose from the perspective of defining the strategy or the approach that you want to determine as far as the objectives for the particular market entry, going out there with best interest, and I think that's the part where I was talked about doing your homework, because if you go out there blindly, there are so many things that can take you down the wrong path, can mislead you or misguide you. It's very hard to see the bigger picture if you're just going in at a single point in time. I think going back regularly, taking a different perspective of things, taking guidance as to which way to look at, but actually working with a respectable person on the ground that you can trust their judgment and value their judgment goes a long way in guiding that process.
Tim, you had a question?
Yeah.
Hi, Tim.
Great presentation. Switch with the microphone.
Emerald have obviously made a conscious decision to put people on the ground that are your own people and officers on the ground in different countries, and I can see why you've done that. Not every publisher has got enough product to make that a worthwhile thing to do, and we have to work through local people.
Yes.
And I was just wondering whether you could just talk about the sort of the challenges of that, and how, any advice for managing those sorts of relationships where you're having to work through a local, either an agent or a reseller.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been an interesting challenge working with local agents, really, because they're not just taking on your own product, they've got other products to manage. And, I think finding the right partner, and again, that's about your network, and so establishing a network that can guide you to the right people, because a number of agents that you could go to. I suppose keeping a good relationship with them, visiting them regularly, and treating them as if they were your employees, in the sense of having that closeness and understanding of the market, not relying on them to hold the knowledge, making sure that they are sharing the knowledge with you, so that as part of a strategy of, like I said, different stage of market entry. If you were working with agents, you may well one day wish to graduate to a more of a local presence yourself. Would allow you to do that, and you can coexist together as well. We have many instances where we've got a local presence with our own people, but we also work with local agents in those territories, sometimes just because the geographical disparity of markets like Indonesia, Philippines, etc., are more than what 1 or 2 or 3, 4 people of your own can handle. So keeping a very good relationship with those, and test them, really stretch them as well, because complacency isn't always what you want in these fast growing markets. Thanks.
Could you share your experiences in India, especially in terms of the change from being viewed as a low-cost outsourcing hub to a generator and consumer of content of scholarly work?
Yeah, that's been an interesting, I've been travelling out to India for the last 10, 12 years, and I've seen that change happen in front of me, in the way that very much viewed as a service economy with, as I said, high volume outputs of services, to an industry that is more strongly focused on, if we're talking publishing, scholarly output, but with challenges that we've seen there with regards to government funding. And when I talk to political volatility, I had the Indian flag there, really, because out of those emerging markets, it's probably the one area that I found to have the most volatility. Hopefully now, with the new president, there is going to be an amount of stability and some good measures, particularly focusing on education. But where you think you're making some level of traction, the next year you can just find you've been set back again. Part of the election process last year meant that they took away the funding from education to fund the party political broadcast. So that is in itself a challenge. But the trajectory is right. As I said, all the ingredients are right for that. A number of high-ranking institutions in India. I think I was recently out at an Indian management conclave with a gathering of deans and professors from the top schools in India. And what they are trying to do is really trying to get on that international stage by talking to international standards, accreditation being one of them. And whilst last year, 2 years ago, there were only 2 schools with AACSB accreditation, actually now there's 36 in the pipeline, and that will happen very quickly. And with that, that will absolutely drive that economy forward.
A related question.
Yes.
What about Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri
Yeah.
Lanka, which is
Yeah, absolutely.
again politically volatile?
Yeah, they are also politically volatile. However, they also have funding. Some of that is World Bank funding that they have, or other bodies such as INASP, which creates the impetus for research funding. And we've worked in partnership with those, and we have actually done deals directly with institutions in Pakistan, with the Higher Education Committee, with UGC in Bangladesh. And what they've done is really fostered a need to understand, okay, what is it that they need as a core collection, and really building on that, and starting small, I suppose, but they are gaining momentum in that regard. Thank you.
Mark Carden from Mosaic Recruitment. I just ask you or any of the panel members about this. I'm a huge fan of localness in sales and cultural sensitivity and those good things, but also I'd be interested in your comments on the occasional advantages of being kind of outside of the local culture in sales situations, which allows you to disengage from local politics, to avoid perhaps expectations of, well, let's say, bribery and things like that, and also to say things that couldn't be said. And certainly I've been in situations where my local agent can't say something to a prospect where I can as the visitor. Do you, any of you, have kind of experience of that and an interest in the creative power of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll let the others talk as well to it, but I think when I was referring to international standards and ethics, I think I didn't mention it, but certainly bribery, we have a Briberies Act that we must adhere to, and that's certainly something that we must educate these markets that just have a different way of working. It's not necessarily bribery as such, but there's a culture of gift giving which could be construed as bribery, but varying degrees of that. We need to be mindful of how we approach that. We can actually stipulate that these are things that we just will not do or engage in, and they can accept that because they can understand that you're coming from a different business background, different culture. But then there's also the element of, as I suggested there, Mark, about being direct and indirect. And in many of these cultures, the approach is to take a slightly indirect route. And I suppose I refer to the bottom right graphic there, which talks about dealing with problems. We'll probably walk straight through it, whereas the cultures in these markets might just skirt around it, but get to the problem at the end at some point. Different ways of working is the reference.
No, I mean, totally agree with everything that's been said. What I would say with regard to sort of standing outside of the local, well, just take one step back. This idea of sort of, understanding local culture is absolutely of paramount importance, whether you're setting up a business abroad or whether you're doing business in another country. But just taking up the point on things like accreditation, I'm dealing with a couple of companies in Hertfordshire who actually do accreditation, and they're doing that in various countries throughout the world. They are outside of the local partner, if you like, or in fact the local country, because they're doing it from a UK point of view. And I have to say, and this isn't just me, by the way, waving the Team GB flag, there is, I guess, an increasing view that in certain countries we are doing things in the proper way, and accreditation is one of those things. I think a lot of companies now in different countries are looking for the UK version of, whatever may or may not be available locally. So I think we do have some advantages there. Personally, I've always been pretty straight talking, but there are definite areas of etiquette to be careful of in certain of the countries that we've mentioned here anyway. And for me, I've always taken a view that, business is about people. You're doing business with people. You're talking to people. And other than doing something really damn stupid, which I doubt if very many people here in this room would do. I think actually if you're dealing in Brighton and you've got clients there in Belgium or Birmingham or Burma, maybe very, very similar from the point of view of common sense is what I'm going to refer to it as.
Thanks, Mark. One of the things I would add, I think one of the strongest statements was in terms of setting standards and living by those standards when you operate overseas. For our own organisation, diversity is key, diversity at all levels within the chemical sciences. When we're operating in other parts of the world where diversity in gender, for example, is not held in the same regard, we have to lead by example. And the same is true when sort of gift giving and bribery. I've been in situations in India, for example, when a professor adopting a product or making a buying decision, the comment may be, "What's in it for me?" And whereas as a UK or US or European organisation, you absolutely know the position that you need to leave. If you're using an agent, I think it's absolutely appropriate that you encourage your agents to work to those standards as well, and that you don't give in to some of the requests in some of the local territories. The UK legislation around bribery is one of the toughest in the world, and there are some significant penalties in place for managers or directors of organisations if you haven't put sufficient standards and guidelines and principles in place. So it's the management of an organisation. It's absolutely key that they ensure that members of their team travelling from Europe or the United States into eastern regions or other BRICS or Mint regions, or staff that they employ in those local regions, also adhere to some of the bribery legislation. So great question, Mark. Thanks. Any other questions for Shariq? If not, if we could show our appreciation. Thank you, Shariq.